The silence was the first thing visitors noticed. Though visitors had become rare over the 3 years, it wasn't merely an absence of sound. It was a presence, a dense, heavy entity that filled the Denver home like a second atmosphere. It had weight, the silence. It pressed against the windows, muffled the Colorado sunlight, and settled in the corners of rooms where laughter once lived. Ernest Anderson had learned to move through it like a diver in deep water, every gesture slow and deliberate, careful not to disturb the delicate, terrible equilibrium of a house in mourning. He stood in the marble-tiled foyer on a Tuesday afternoon in December, his briefcase dangling from fingers gone numb from both the cold and the dread that accompanied this threshold. He hadn't planned to be here. A merger meeting with the board of his tech firm had ended abruptly when the opposing counsel's flight was canceled due to a front-range snow squall. At 2:17 p.m., Ernest found himself with an empty calendar and a profound, aching aversion to the one place he was supposed to go. He'd driven the 20 minutes from his downtown Denver office in a haze, taking the longer route through Washington Park, stalling. But now, here he was, the grand, custom-built home in Cherry Hills Village, all glass and timber and soaring ceilings, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully appointed tomb. He turned the key. The click too loud in the quiet street. He pushed the heavy oak door inward and stepped into the conditioned air, bracing himself for the wall of stillness that always greeted him. But it didn't come. Instead, music met him. It was soft, barely there. The delicate strains of a piano sonata. Mozart, maybe. It drifted from the direction of the living room, woven through with the faintest scent of lemon polish and, inexplicably, vanilla. Ernest froze, his hand still on the door handle. His heart, a sluggish organ he'd half convinced himself was merely a pump for moving tired blood, gave a single, hard thump against his ribs. Then another. A frantic, panicked rhythm began where for years there had been only a weary, mournful cadence. The house had not known music for 3 years, not since the morning of the accident. Catherine had been humming in the kitchen, making pancakes shaped like elephants for the twins' 3rd birthday. The last coherent sound Ernest remembered from his daughters was Lily's giggle as a glob of syrup landed on Ella's nose. The music had died that afternoon, along with everything else. His mind raced through impossible explanations. A television left on, the cleaning service, but the cleaning service came on Mondays, and they never used the sound system. He'd given strict instructions. Silence is important for the girls' routine. He'd hired Melinda Brown 6 weeks ago to manage the household cooking, cleaning, the day-to-day logistics that had overwhelmed him, but she was quiet, efficient, nearly invisible. She understood the rules. The silence was rule number 1. He moved forward, his Italian loafers soundless on the runner. The music grew slightly clearer, and then, beneath the crystalline notes of the piano, he heard it. Laughter. High, bright, unself-conscious, child's laughter. It wasn't the tinny sound from a device. It was real, airy, and alive. It was a sound he heard in his dreams and woke from choking on its memory. It was their sound. A violent tremor started in his hands and radiated outwards. He felt unmoored, dizzy. He dropped his briefcase. It hit the floor with a dull thud that was swallowed by the music. He didn't pick it up. He was drawn forward, a man pulled by a siren song he thought was lost to him forever. The double doors to the living room were slightly ajar. He approached them as one might approach a holy relic or a sleeping predator, with a mixture of awe and terror. He peered through the crack. The world stopped. The room was bathed in the pale, silver-white light of a winter afternoon. The floor was clear of the usual therapeutic clutter: the foam mats, the sensory bins, the piles of specialized toys that screamed of effort and failure. In the center of the open space stood Melinda. But she wasn't the Melinda he knew, the woman in muted sweaters and practical slacks, who moved like a ghost from room to room. This Melinda wore soft, gray leggings and a simple tunic. Her eyes were closed, a small, peaceful smile on her face. Her arms were raised above her head, not in a rigid pose, but as if she were holding a fragile, wide bubble. And she was moving, not dancing in any formal sense, but flowing. Her body described gentle arcs and curves, swaying like sea grass in a slow current. She moved with a profound, innate grace that spoke of training he would never have guessed. And on either side of her, mirroring her slow-motion ballet, were his daughters, Ella and Lily, now 6 years old, wore matching pink tutus over their leggings. Their movements were clumsy, halting, a faint echo of Melinda's fluidity, but they were trying. Their small arms were aloft, their faces turned upward, and on their faces on their faces was an expression Ernest had not seen since the before. Pure, unfiltered joy. A light was in their eyes, a focus, a presence. Lily's mouth was open in a soundless laugh, her body rocking in time with some internal rhythm that seemed, miraculously, to match the music. Ella was more contained, her movements smaller, but her gaze was fixed on Melinda with an intensity that was its own kind of speech. Ernest's knees buckled. He grabbed the doorframe, his fingers digging into the wood. A sound escaped him, a ragged half-sob, half-gasp. 3 heads turned. Melinda's eyes flew open, her movement freezing. The girls stopped, their arms slowly lowering. For a terrifying second, Ernest watched the light in their eyes flicker, threatening to recede back into the distant, inaccessible place where it had lived for 3 years. He had broken the spell. He, the interloper, the ghost of grief who lived in this house, had shattered this impossible, beautiful moment. Then Ella did something that stopped his breath entirely. Her gaze, usually skittering away from any direct contact, landed on his face. It held. Her deep brown eyes, so like Catherine's, looked directly into his. He saw confusion there, then a dawning recognition that seemed to pierce through the fog that had enveloped her. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted one small hand, the one clad in the pink tutu's sleeve, and reached it out toward him. Not a vague gesture, a direct, intentional reach, an invitation, or perhaps a question. Ernest Anderson, CEO of a company valued at $500 million, a man who commanded boardrooms and navigated international deals, crumpled. He dropped to his knees right there in the doorway, the dam inside him breaking. Tears he didn't know he still possessed poured down his face, hot and relentless. He couldn't speak. He could only look at his daughter's outstretched hand, a tiny bridge across an ocean of silence. Melinda recovered first. She didn't scold, didn't explain, didn't apologize. She simply knelt down to the girl's level, her movements still carrying that same gentle rhythm. She looked at Ernest, her own eyes bright with unshed tears, then back at the girls. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice a low, soothing melody. "See? Daddy's home." Lily, emboldened, took a wobbly step toward him. Then another. She stopped a few feet away, studying his tear-streaked face with clinical curiosity. Then she smiled, a small, tentative smile that shattered what was left of Ernest's heart. He couldn't bear the distance. Slowly, giving them every chance to retreat, he stretched out his own trembling hands. For 3 years, his touch had been met with stiffening, with frantic pulling away, with silent, terrible rejection. He braced for it now. Lily placed her hand in his. Ella, watching her sister, moved forward and did the same. Their small, warm palms lay in his. They didn't grip, but they didn't pull away. They simply were, present, connected, in the room with him. The music from the sound system reached its gentle conclusion and faded into silence. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating void. It was a quiet filled with the soft sound of breathing, with the residual energy of movement, with a fragile, newborn hope. Ernest looked up at Melinda, who still knelt nearby, a quiet witness to this resurrection. His voice, when he found it, was shredded, barely a whisper. How Melinda swallowed. She looked from the girls' faces back to his. For a moment, she seemed to wrestle with something, fear flickering in her gaze. Then it settled into a sad, knowing resolve. She spoke softly, her words not an accusation, but a simple, devastating truth. "They were never unreachable, Mr. Anderson," she said. "They just needed someone willing to meet them where they are." The words landed in the center of his chest. Meet them where they are. For 3 years, he had thrown money, expertise, and frantic energy at the problem of his daughters. He had hired a small army of specialists, 15 of them, each with impeccable credentials and confident, clinical approaches. Behavioral therapists who used rigid reward charts, speech pathologists who drilled them on flashcards, occupational therapists with elaborate sensory gyms. He had paid over $1 million in a desperate campaign to drag his girls back into the world he understood. A world of words, of eye contact, of normalcy. He had tried to fix them, to repair what the trauma of losing their mother had seemingly broken. And this woman, this quiet, unassuming maid he'd hired from a boutique domestic agency, paying her a fraction of what he paid the specialists per hour had done in 6 weeks, what all others had failed to do in 3 years. She hadn't dragged them anywhere. She had, somehow, gone to them. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. She was young, 29, with a calm, unremarkable prettiness that was easy to overlook. But now he saw the intelligence in her hazel eyes, a depth of perception he'd mistaken for shyness. He saw the way she held her body, a latent grace even in stillness. Who was she? You. He began, but couldn't finish. You're a miracle worker. You're an angel. What are you? It's just movement, Melinda said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. She glanced at the girls, who were now gently swaying, still holding Ernest's hands in a silent, shared rhythm. It's another language. Sometimes it's the first language, Ernest's mind reeled. Catherine had known that. Catherine, his vibrant, dancing wife. She had been a dancer in college, not professionally, but with a passion that infused her life. She'd bounced the girls on her hip to Beatles songs, had waltzed them around the kitchen, had soothed their infant cries with slow, rocking sways. She'd always said, they feel the music in their bones, Ernie. They understand it better than words. After her death, in his grief and desperation, he had dismissed that as whimsy. He had sought science, not soul. He had locked away her ballet scores and packed up her music, believing that to move forward, he had to seal away the past. And all the while, the key to his daughters had been in the very thing he'd abandoned. He became aware of the girls letting go of his hands. Lily turned and padded back to the center of the room, her tutu bouncing. She looked at Melinda and raised her arms again, a clear request. Ella followed suit, her movement more hesitant, but her intent clear. Melinda looked at Ernest, a question in her eyes. Is this okay? Do I continue? He couldn't speak. He just nodded, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve, a clumsy, childlike gesture. He shuffled back on his knees to lean against the doorframe, making himself small, unthreatening. A spectator, not an intruder, Melinda gave him a small, grateful smile. She rose and moved to the sound system controls. A different piece began, something with strings, warmer than the piano. She returned to the center of the space, took a deep breath, and began to move again. This time, her motions were even simpler, a slow raising of one arm, a tilt of the head, a shift of weight from one foot to the other. The girls watched, rapt. Then Lily mimicked the arm raise. Not perfectly, but the intention was a blazing signal in the quiet room. Ella, after a moment, tilted her head. Ernest watched, his heart swelling with a painful, beautiful ache. He watched as Melinda, this stranger in his house, communicated with his children in a silent, fluid dialogue. She wasn't teaching them to be normal. She was speaking to them in a dialect they inherently understood. She was, he realized with a jolt, giving them back a piece of their mother, not by replacing her, but by channeling the same essence Catherine had embodied, connection through emotion, love expressed not just in words, but in presence. As he watched Lily's face break into another gummy, joyous smile, a fierce, protective certainty crystallized within him. He would not question this. He would not analyze it or demand credentials. He had seen the result, felt the truth of it in his daughter's hands. This was not pseudoscience or luck. This was alchemy. But alongside the wonder bloomed a sharp, nagging curiosity. How did she know? The question was a quiet drumbeat in his mind. Her efficiency, her calm, the way she moved it all hinted at a history, a training she hadn't disclosed. She'd presented herself as a household manager, competent and discreet. This was something else entirely. This was a calling. The session wound down as the winter light began to fade. Melinda gradually slowed her movements until she was just standing, breathing deeply. The girls, seeming to understand the ritual, did the same. She then walked to each of them, placed a gentle hand on their heads, and said softly, "Beautiful dancing, my friends." She didn't condescend. She spoke to them as equals, as partners in the endeavor. She then glanced at Ernest. "I should get started on their dinner," she said, her voice slipping back into the professional, neutral tone he was used to. It was a curtain falling, the magical space of the last half hour receding into the mundane. "Of course," Ernest said, his own voice hoarse. He pushed himself up from the floor, his body feeling old and stiff. The girls, suddenly seeming to remember their habitual patterns, wandered away from the center of the room, though their energy felt different, lighter, less trapped. Melinda gave him one more inscrutable look, then moved toward the kitchen. Her footsteps quiet, Ernest stood alone in the living room doorway. The house was settling back into its usual quiet, but the quality of the silence was forever altered. It was no longer the silence of the grave. It was the silence after a storm, cleansed and holding the promise of new growth. He knew, with absolute clarity, that his life had just been divided into a before and an after. Before this afternoon and after, everything had changed. And as he looked down the hall toward the kitchen, hearing the soft clatter of pans, he knew his mission had changed, too. He would protect this fragile new reality at all costs, and he would uncover the mystery of Melinda Brown. For whoever she was, whatever her past, she held the fragile, luminous thread that was leading his daughters and him back into the light. But for now, he simply walked into the living room, sat on the floor where his girls had danced, put his head in his hands, and wept tears of a grief that was finally, blessedly, beginning to transform. Ernest didn't speak of what he'd witnessed, not to his assistant, not to his few remaining friends, certainly not to Dr. Althea Morrison, the lead behavioral therapist whose invoices still arrived with clockwork regularity, detailing services that now seemed not just ineffective, but grotesquely misplaced. To name the miracle felt dangerous, like speaking of a dream upon waking and watching it dissolve. So he held it close, a secret warmth against the 3-year winter inside him. Instead, he acted. He began, subtly at first, to reshape his life around the heartbeat of that living room. His meetings were delegated, postponed, or ruthlessly shortened. Where he had once used work as a refuge, a fortress of spreadsheets and strategy calls to hide from the haunting quiet of home, he now found it an intolerable prison. An urgent, primal pull drew him back to Cherry Hills Village. He started coming home earlier, first by an hour, then 2. By the end of that first transformative week, he was leaving the office by noon, offering vague excuses about migraines or remote work. His assistant, a perceptive woman named Chloe, stopped questioning after the 3rd day when she saw the lost, hollow look in his eyes replaced by something sharper, almost feverish with intent. She simply cleared his calendar and fielded the calls. He developed a routine of stealth. He would slip into the house through the garage entrance, tow off his shoes in the mudroom, and move through the rooms like a ghost, a grateful phantom haunting his own home. He learned the sightlines, the creaky floorboard near the staircase, the way the afternoon sun fell in the hall. He became a scholar of observation, watching from doorways, from the shadowed kitchen breakfast nook, from the top of the stairs where the railing offered a partial screen. What he saw in those stolen hours broke him open in ways he hadn't known were possible. It wasn't therapy as he understood it, no flashcards, no token boards, no stern directives. It was something far more profound and simple. It was life, imbued with a gentle, pervasive rhythm. Melinda didn't work with the girls. She lived with them. She hummed while she folded laundry in the sunroom, her body swaying slightly with the task. And Lily, who for 3 years had existed in a world of repetitive rocking and distant stares, would stop her rhythmic motion, her hands pausing in midair, and her eyes would track Melinda. Not a glance, but a deep, attentive watching. The connection was silent, tangible. One afternoon, Ernest watched from the kitchen as Melinda set the table for the girls' lunch. It was a simple task, but she performed it with a silent cadence. Plate a soft tap on the wood, fork a gentle clink, cup a hollow thud, napkin a whisper of paper. She did it without looking, her attention on the sandwich she was slicing. But the rhythm was consistent, a little percussive poem. Across the room, sitting on the floor with a pile of textured blocks, Ella's hands began to move. Not randomly. She mirrored the pattern. A flat press of her palm against the carpet plate, A tap of two blocks together fork. A knock on the floor cup. A soft swipe of her hand napkin. She was learning a song without words, communicating through mirrored pulse. Ernest's breath caught. She was listening. Everything Melinda did carried this undercurrent. Chopping vegetables had a staccato beat. Sweeping became a long, flowing arc. When she helped the girls wash their hands, she guided their small fingers under the water in a slow 1-2-3 count, turning hygiene into a gentle dance. The house, once a museum of stillness, was becoming a living body with its own quiet circulation. One afternoon, he watched the daily ordeal of getting dressed. For 3 years, this had been a battleground. The feel of certain fabrics, the invasion of sleeves over heads, the disruption of their self-contained worlds had triggered meltdowns that left Ernest feeling helpless and brutal. He watched now from the cracked door of the girls' bedroom, his heart already clenching in anticipation of the storm. Melinda stood before Ella, holding a soft, purple sweater. She didn't approach directly. She held it up, not as an obligation, but as an object of interest. She swayed it gently from side to side, humming a tuneless, soothing note. Ella, who would normally have turned away or begun to fuss, watched the swinging fabric. Her eyes followed the motion. After a moment, her own body began a slight, echoing sway. Melinda, seeing the engagement, moved closer. "Arm time," she murmured, her voice a melodic whisper. She took Ella's hand and, in time with the swaying rhythm, guided it slowly through the sleeve. And other arm, the same gentle, rhythmic guidance. No tears, no fight, just a peaceful, almost cooperative motion. She repeated the process with Lily, turning it into a synchronized, silent game. Ernest's chest ached with a painful tightness. It was so familiar. Catherine had moved like that. She had swayed the girls to sleep, had bounced them on her hip while stirring pasta sauce, had turned diaper changes into silly little tap dancing rituals. She had understood something in her bones that Ernest, in his linear, problem-solving mind, had missed entirely. The girls didn't need to be fixed into a neurotypical mold. They needed to be met. They needed someone to step into their sensory universe, to communicate in the language of pattern, pressure, and pace. Melinda, this stranger, was speaking Catherine's native tongue. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, came the moment that stole the air from Ernest's lungs. He was pretending to work on his laptop in the adjoining study, the door ajar. Melinda was in the living room with the girls, the usual soft music playing. He heard her voice, calm and clear. "Watch," she said. Not a command, an invitation. He peered through the gap. Melinda stood in the center of the rug. She took a deep, audible breath and slowly raised both arms out to her sides, palms facing upwards, as if lifting to invisible, weightless trays. She held the pose for a 5 count, then lowered them with the same deliberate slowness. She did it again, and a third time. It was a simple, beautiful, sun salutation-like movement. Lily was watching, her head tilted. On the 4th repetition, as Melinda's arms began their ascent, Lily's own small arms twitched. Then, haltingly, they began to rise. She mirrored the movement, her palms turning up, her eyes fixed on Melinda with intense concentration. She didn't get it perfectly. Her arms were lower, her movement jerkier, but the intention was a blazing, unmistakable signal. She was imitating. After 3 years of closed-off, self-directed stimming, she was engaging in socially mirrored behavior. Ernest's hand froze on his trackpad. A burning wave rose from his chest to his throat, hot and desperate. He wanted to sob, to cheer, to burst into the room and wrap all 3 of them in an embrace that could somehow convey the tectonic shift happening in his soul. But he didn't move. He was terrified of breaking the spell. He sat utterly still, watching this quiet woman with no official credentials unlock his daughters with nothing but presence, patience, and rhythm. And that's when the question, which had been simmering, boiled over and struck him with the force of a physical blow. How did she know? It wasn't just intuition. The grace of her movement was trained. The pacing was expert. The way she structured the environment, the way she used space and sound, it was methodology. This wasn't a lucky guess by a kindly maid. It was the application of a skill set she had hidden. As he watched Melinda guide the girls into another gentle movement, A slow spin with arms overhead. Ernest studied her. There was a sadness in her grace, a weight in her stillness when she wasn't moving. She carried a story. He had been so consumed by his own tragedy that he'd never considered she might have one of her own. He'd hired a function, not a person. But the person was there, and she held the key to his world in her gentle, capable hands. And she was hiding in plain sight, that night, after a dinner where the girls were visibly more relaxed. After he had read them a story, they didn't look at the pictures, but they let him sit closer. And Lily leaned her head against his arm for a full 30 seconds. He found Melinda in the kitchen. She was wiping down the already spotless counters, her back to him. The house was quiet, settled in the post-bedtime hush. Melinda. His voice was rougher than he intended. Scraped raw by the day's emotions, she turned, the dishcloth in her hand, her eyes widening a fraction. In the 3 years since Catherine's death, through a rotating cast of nurses, aides, and now household staff, Ernest had never asked anyone to stay after hours. His interactions were transactional, instructions given, reports received, checks signed. Of course, Mr. Anderson. She set the cloth down, her hands coming to rest neatly in front of her apron, a gesture that suddenly seemed less like servility and more like a shield. He gestured to the small, wrought iron table by the bay window overlooking the dark garden. Sit, please. The formality felt absurd, but he couldn't break it. They sat across from each other, the only light coming from the under-cabinet leads, casting their faces in soft relief and deep shadow. The silence stretched, filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the weight of unspoken questions. Where did you learn it? He finally blurted out. What you do with them. The way you move. The way you reach them. Melinda's face went perfectly still, a mask settling over her features. She looked down at her hands, which were now clenched in her lap. I don't mean to overstep by asking, Ernest rushed on, the words tumbling out. I need to understand. 15 specialists over 3 years couldn't do what you've done in 6 weeks. Mr. Anderson, she began, her voice tight. Ernest, please. She looked up then, and in the dim light, he saw it clearly, a profound, old pain that mirrored his own. It wasn't the same shape, but it was carved from the same dark material. She took a shaky breath. I wasn't always a maid, she said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, a confession. He waited, not daring to speak. I have a master's degree in dance therapy. I worked as a dance and movement therapist for 3 years at a children's clinic. My specialization was nonverbal communication, primarily with kids on the autism spectrum. Each sentence was released like something painful being drawn from a wound. Ernest felt the world tilt. A trained therapist, living in his guest wing, scrubbing his floors. You're licensed. Was, she corrected softly, her gaze dropping again. I gave up my license. I'm not practicing anymore. What happened? The question was out before he could consider its intrusiveness. Burnout. The word was a stark, empty echo in the quiet kitchen. I took every failure personally. Every child I couldn't reach, every parent's disappointed face. It felt like a moral failing. The weight of it. I just broke. 2 years ago, I walked away. I took domestic jobs because they were simple. You clean, you cook, you leave. There's no expectation to perform miracles. No heartbreak when you can't. She gave a small, bitter laugh that held no humor. I was trying to heal, to forget. Ernest felt as if he'd been punched. The sheer, stupid, tragic waste of it. This woman, with this gift, hiding from it in his home. But you saw it, he whispered. From the first day. You knew what Ella and Lily needed. She nodded, a tear finally escaping to trace a path down her cheek. I saw it immediately. The way they moved, the way they retreated into their own rhythms. I knew traditional, verbal heavy approaches were just adding noise. I knew they needed someone to join their rhythm before asking them to learn a new one. She wiped the tear away angrily. But I was terrified to say anything. Who would believe the maid? You hired me to manage the house, not to therapize your children. I thought if I just did it quietly, without drawing attention, maybe I could help a little without overstepping, without getting attached. I've been paying you minimum wage to clean floors, Ernest said, his voice thick with a rage directed entirely at himself. while you've been doing what I paid specialists 6 figures to fail at. Mr. Anderson, Ernest, no. She met his eyes, her own fierce now. You gave me a safe place, a quiet place. You didn't ask for miracles. You just asked for order. In trying to provide that, I found my way back to the work, but on my own terms, without the pressure. She gestured vaguely upstairs, toward the girls' rooms. They taught me. They showed me that connection doesn't have to be grand or dramatic. It can be in a sway, in a pattern of setting a table. Ernest stared at her, this remarkable, wounded, healing woman. The final piece of his old, broken mindset shattered. It wasn't about credentials or invoices or clinical reports. It was about this human connection, offered with humility and grace. Teach me, he said suddenly, the words welling up from a deep, newfound conviction. She blinked. What? Teach me. How to reach them. How to be present with them the way you are. How to speak their language. His voice cracked. I've been their father, but I've been absent for 3 years. I'm ready. I need to come home. Really come home. Melinda studied him for a long, silent moment. She was weighing his sincerity, measuring the risk to her own hard-won peace. He saw the fear, the desire to retreat back into the safety of being just a help. But he also saw the therapist in her, the part that still longed to facilitate healing, to rebuild bridges. It's not about technique, Ernest, she said finally, her voice low. It's about showing up, being patient, meeting them in their world, instead of always trying to drag them into ours. Then teach me that, he pleaded. Slowly, she nodded. Okay. But as she agreed, Ernest saw a flicker in her eyes, something beyond uncertainty. It was a deep, familiar fear. She was opening a door she'd spent 2 years nailing shut. And he, in his desperate gratitude, had no idea that by inviting her deeper into their lives, he was asking her to face the very demons that had shattered her. He was asking her to practice again, to care again, to risk her heart again. And neither of them could foresee that this fragile new alliance would soon be tested by a discovery from the past and a threat from the present that would force them to decide what and who they were truly fighting for. The key felt cold and heavy in Ernest's palm, a tiny sliver of metal that held the weight of 1,000 memories. He hadn't touched it in 3 years. The door it belonged too thick. Solid oak at the end of the upstairs hall had become a wall in his mind, a boundary between the life he was forced to live and the life that had been obliterated. Catherine's music room. It was her sanctuary, a space with sprung flooring, a bar along one mirrored wall, and a professional sound system. Here she had maintained the dancer she'd been before marriage and motherhood. Here she had swayed with infant Ella and Lily strapped to her chest. Here, in the last months of her life, she had begun to imagine teaching them. Their small hands on the bar beside hers. After the accident, Ernest had locked it. He couldn't bear the echo of her absence in a space so definitively hers. He'd considered having it cleared out, turned into a gym or another guest room, but could never give the order. So it sat, a time capsule of joy, gathering dust behind a locked door. Now, a week after the kitchen confession, he stood before it with Melinda beside him. Her work had revealed the need for more space, for a dedicated area free from the associations of therapy failures and household chores. They need a place, she had said gently, a place that's just for connection, for beauty. He knew she was right, and he knew, with a certainty that both terrified and steadied him, that it was time. Just do what you need to do, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He pressed the key into her hand, his fingers brushing hers. The trust in the gesture was absolute. Melinda took the key, her expression solemn. She treated the moment with a reverence that eased his fear. She unlocked the door, turned the knob, and pushed it open. The air that drifted out was still, cool, and carried a faint scent of rosin and old wood. Late afternoon light filtered through the slatted blinds, illuminating dancing motes of dust. The room was exactly as Catherine had left it. Her favorite ballet slippers, worn soft and satiny, sat on a shelf. Framed photos of her in various performances adorned the walls. Books on choreography and anatomy lined a case. A wedding photo of the two of them, caught mid-laugh, beamed from the top of the piano. Melinda moved inside like someone entering a cathedral. She didn't rush. She ran a hand along the bar, a sad, knowing smile touching her lips. "This is perfect," she murmured. The floor, the light. Ernest hovered in the doorway, a ghost at his own past. He watched as she began a gentle inventory, not disturbing, just assessing. She opened the closet, a deep walk-in where Catherine kept costumes and practice wear. Melinda worked methodically, folding a discarded sweater, smoothing a gauzy skirt. Then she paused. "Ernest." He stepped inside. She was crouched, looking at the back of the closet. Behind Catherine's wedding dress, preserved in a garment bag, was a plain, cardboard banker's box. It was unmarked, covered in a fine layer of dust. "I think you should look at this," Melinda said softly. Together, they pulled the box into the center of the room. Ernest's heart hammered against his ribs. He lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of small, black memory drives, the kind used in digital cameras. Each one had a white label with Catherine's neat, looping handwriting, dates. Some from over 7 years ago, Paris honeymoon, positive test. Others from the infant years, first giggles minus for Moss, twin dance party minus 18 Moss. And then more recent ones, Ella says mama minus 2.5 years. Lily loves leaves minus 2.8 YRS. At the very bottom was one with a date that stopped his breath. It was 2 days before the accident. Melinda's hand found his shoulder. "I think you need to see them," she whispered. He couldn't speak. He could only stare at his wife's handwriting, a physical piece of her that felt more immediate than any photograph. He felt 5 years old, scared and lost. "Will you stay?" The plea ripped from him, raw and childlike. I can't do this alone." Melinda simply sat on the floor beside him, her presence a silent vow. "I'm here." With trembling hands, Ernest found his laptop, plugged in the first drive labeled positive test. The screen flickered, and there she was. Catherine, younger, her hair a bit longer, sitting cross-legged on the floor of this very room. She was wearing a tank top and leggings, a slight baby bump just visible. She looked exhausted, radiant, her eyes sparkling with tears of joy. "Hello, my sweet girls," she said to the camera, her voice warm and clear, a direct punch to Ernest's heart. He gasped. He hadn't heard her voice in 3 years, except in dreams. It was exactly as he remembered. "If you're watching this, it means Mama isn't there to tell you herself. So I'm making these. A library of me. My voice, my face, my silly dances." She grinned, that infectious, lopsided grin. "Because I know words might be hard for you sometimes. But movement, music, that's a language everyone understands. Especially you two. I feel you dancing in here already." She patted her stomach, her eyes soft with love. The video showed her singing a silly, made-up song, swaying her shoulders. Then another clip of her demonstrating a simple play. "See up and down." Like breathing, Ernest wept silently as he clicked through drive after drive. A treasury of motherhood, meticulously archived. Catherine singing lullabies, Catherine demonstrating how to blow a dandelion, Catherine using slow, exaggerated movements to act out a story. In every frame, she moved with that innate, fluid grace, the same grace he now saw in Melinda's work. It was a roadmap, a love letter in motion, left for the daughters she feared she might not get to guide in person. Finally, with the last of his courage, he opened the final drive. 2 days before the accident. Catherine looked tired but determined. She sat closer to the camera, her face serious. "Ernest," she began, and he flinched at the sound of his name in her voice. "My love, if something happens to me, if I'm not here." She took a steadying breath. "Don't let the girls stop moving. However they move, in whatever way feels right to them. Movement is their language, their first language. Find someone who understands that. A therapist, a teacher, someone who speaks dance. Don't let your grief, as deep and real as it will be, don't let it freeze them. Keep them flowing. Promise me." The video ended. The screen went black, reflecting Ernest's shattered face back at him. A sound escaped him, a wounded, animal noise from a place deeper than grief. He dropped his head into his hands and sobbed great, heaving, unrestrained sobs that shook his entire frame. It was the first time he had truly cried for her, for the monstrous unfairness of it all, for the years lost, for the map she had left that he had been too blind to see. Melinda didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it was okay. She simply placed her hand on his back, a steady, warm pressure, and let him break. She bore witness. Dr. Morrison's observation was an autopsy. She sat in the corner of the music room, her spine rigid, a clipboard on her knee, her face a mask of clinical detachment. Melinda, visibly nervous, conducted the session. The girls, sensitive to the new, hostile energy, were hesitant but tried. Lily even offered a sophomore. When the music stopped, afterward, in the hallway, Dr. Morrison's verdict was swift and brutal. Dangerous, unregulated, pseudoscience, echolaic parroting, not true communication, an ethical obligation to report to Child Protective Services. The threat of CPS was a nuclear weapon, and she had deployed it. Ernest stood, shell-shocked, as she dismantled their miracle with clinical terminology. She represented the world of evidence-based practice, of credentials and institutional approval. She had consumed $180,000 of his money and given him despair. He looked from her stern face to the living room where Melinda hovered, protecting the girls. He thought of the silence, and then the music, the withdrawal, and then the reach for hand, the void, and then the word again. "You had 3 years," Ernest said, his voice quiet but iron strong. 3 years and $2 million. You gave me charts. He nodded toward Melinda, gave me back my daughters. You're making a mistake you'll regret. Dr. Morrison hissed, then it's mine to make. He held the door open until she left, her heels clicking a staccato of finality on the marble floor. But the poison was sown. 3 days later, Ernest found Melinda packing her car. "I'm giving my notice," she said, not meeting his eyes. "I'm overstepping. I'm just the maid. I can't be the reason you lose them," he pleaded. But the damage of his earlier silence, his failure to make her feel like family, to honor her as more than staff, was done. She believed she was a liability. She planned to leave in 2 weeks. Her withdrawal was a physical blow to the girls. Lily stopped speaking. Ella resumed spinning. They took up a silent vigil at the living room window every day at 3 p.m., waiting for the Melinda who had vanished even before she left. Ernest tried to replicate her magic, but he was a novice speaking a language he'd just begun to learn. He was failing them again. The crisis point came when he found Ella trying to dance alone in the empty music room, her small arms failing to recreate the grace, her face collapsing into silent, desperate tears. It was the first time he'd seen her cry since the accident. She wasn't crying from overwhelm or sensory pain. She was crying from loss, from heartbreak. That night, Ernest Ray watched Catherine's final video. Don't let grief freeze them. He had been frozen. He was letting Melinda freeze, too, out of fear. He was about to lose the second love of his life because he was too cowardly to name it. On Melinda's last scheduled day, he intercepted her at her car. He didn't plead this time. He led her to the transformed music room. He had worked for 2 weeks, restoring Catherine's sound system, framing Ella's drawings, dozens of them, all showing for people holding hands dancing, with a blonde woman, Catherine, smiling in the corner. "You're not just the maid," he said, the words finally free. "You never were. You saved my daughters. You saved me." He took a breath that felt like his first in 3 years. "Melinda, I'm in love with you." The confession hung in the air. Before she could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. "Melly." The girls stood there, drawn by her presence. Ernest knelt. "She knew," he said to them, pointing at Catherine's portrait, then to Melinda. "And she knows. Will you help me do this right?" He played Catherine's lullaby. Lily began to sway. Ella took Melinda's hand. Melinda, weeping, took Ernest's. They formed a circle in the center of the room where Catherine's spirit lived strongest. And they began to move. Not a performance, a communion. Midway, Lily stopped. She looked at the portrait, then at their joined hands, her face alight with a profound understanding. "Mama singing," she said, clear and sure. "We dancing. Mama happy." It was the absolution Ernest didn't know he needed. He broke, sobbing, and his daughters held him. For the first time, grief was not an abyss, but a shared embrace. When he looked up, his hand in Melinda's, he saw the future in her eyes, messy, beautiful, and full of grace. 6 months later, spring warmed the Denver house. In the backyard, Melinda Melly now whirled with Lily and Ella under a sapphire sky. Lily's vocabulary bloomed past 200 words. Ella communicated in a unique symphony of gesture, movement, and some speech. They were not cured. They were themselves, connected, and Ernest watched from the porch, his heart full. Melinda caught his eye and smiled. She had stayed, not as staff, but as family. They had faced down Dr. Morrison's formal complaint together, armed with video diaries of progress and a fierce, united front. The threat had evaporated in the face of the girl's undeniable flourishing. Later, Ernest placed a new photo on the mantel beside Catherine's portrait. It showed all four of them mid-laugh in the backyard, a blur of joyful motion. Beneath it, Ella had carefully written, "We dance, we love, we family." Ernest traced the words. He finally understood. Healing wasn't forgetting Catherine. It was making her love a living part of their ongoing story. Melinda wasn't a replacement. She was a second chapter, a different kind of dance to the same song of devotion. Love didn't replace love. It multiplied. Grace didn't erase grief. It walked beside it, hand in hand. And sometimes, the miracle you prayed for arrived not with fanfare, but with a quiet rhythm, an understanding heart, and the courage to begin dancing again, barefoot and imperfect, in the sacred, messy, beautiful reality of a life reclaimed. When the storm finally passed, leaving him hollowed out and raw, he looked up. His face was wet, his eyes swollen. In the dim light of the room, he saw not just a ghost, but a legacy. "She knew," he whispered, his voice wrecked. "She knew, and I locked it all away. I locked her away." "You were grieving," Melinda said softly, her own cheeks wet. "You did what you could to survive." He shook his head, but the old, corrosive guilt didn't take hold. Instead, a new resolve, hard and clear, formed in its place. He looked at the box of drives, then at Melinda, her face etched with compassion in the twilight. "She left a road map," he said, his voice gaining strength. "And God, or fate, or whatever you want to call it, sent you to help me follow it." He picked up the final drive. "Will you help me? Help me use these? Let them hear their mother again. Let them learn from her, through you." Melinda nodded, her eyes shining. Every day, but as Ernest clutched the plastic drive, neither of them could know that resurrecting Catherine's voice would not just heal, it would reveal. It would unlock a depth of understanding in the girls that would prove Catherine had been more right than she could have imagined, and would force Ernest to defend the fragile new world they were building from those who viewed it as a threat. 2 weeks later, the miracle deepened. Catherine's voice had become part of the daily fabric of the music room. Her lullabies, her instructions, her playful narration filled the space. Ernest feared it would trigger regression, a painful confusion. Instead, Ella and Lily responded like plants to the sun. Their movements became more fluid, their engagement more sustained. It was as if a part of their brains, dormant since the trauma, recognized this frequency and woke up. That afternoon, they were all in the room. Ernest, Melinda, and the girls. Catherine's favorite Brahms lullaby played. Melinda was guiding them through a simple sequence: reach, turn, fold. The girls followed, their faces serene with concentration. Midway through a turn, Lily stopped dead. The room froze. Ernest's heart plummeted. Was it too much? Had they pushed too far? Lily stood perfectly still, staring not at the mirror, not at the window, but directly at Melinda. Her brow was furrowed in deep thought. Then, clear as a bell in the quiet room, she spoke, again. The word hung in the air, perfectly enunciated, full of intent. The music played on, but to Ernest, the world had gone utterly silent save for that one precious word. He slapped a hand over his mouth to stifle a cry. Melinda's eyes flooded, but her therapist's training held. She kept her face calm, her voice even. "Again," she echoed gently. "You want to do it again, sweetheart?" Lily nodded, a firm, deliberate dip of her chin. Then she said it again, clearer. Again, Ernest couldn't draw a breath. His daughter, his nonverbal daughter. She had not just parroted a sound. She had assessed an activity, formed a desire, and communicated it. Intentionally, Melinda, smiling through her tears, raised her arms, beginning the sequence anew. This time, Lily mouthed the words silently as she moved. Again, when they finished, Lily didn't retreat into herself. She turned her head and looked at her father. She truly saw him. And then she spoke two words that dismantled the last of Ernest's broken heart and began rebuilding it anew. Mama singing. Full meaning. A statement. A connection. That sound is Mama. Mama is singing. Ernest fell to his knees. Lily walked over, not shuffled, not drifted, walked with purpose and placed her small, cool hand on his wet cheek. Mama singing, she repeated. We dance, he gathered her in, and for the first time since she was a toddler, Lily wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. Ella, drawn by the powerful emotion, pressed her whole body against his side, burying her face in his shirt. Melinda knelt with them, her hand on Ernest's shaking shoulder. Completing the circle, she spoke. Ernest choked out. She did, Melinda whispered, her voice thick with joy. That night, Ernest sat in his dark office, the digital recording of Lily's again, playing on a loop. He should have been ecstatic, calling family, alerting the world. Instead, a cold, pragmatic fear settled in his gut. This breakthrough was unorthodox. It existed outside the sanctioned charts of behavioral milestones. It was born of unregulated methods by an unlicensed former therapist. He thought of Dr. Althea Morrison, her sharp, disapproving face. He had, foolishly, emailed her the video this morning with the subject line, breakthrough. He'd been bursting with pride, desperate for validation from the authority he'd once revered. Her reply had been a terse, I need to observe. Tomorrow, 3 p.m., the battle lines, he realized with a sinking heart, were about to be drawn, and he was utterly unprepared. When the storm finally passed, leaving him hollowed out and raw, he looked up. His face was wet, his eyes swollen. In the dim light of the room, he saw not just a ghost, but a legacy. She knew, he whispered, his voice wrecked. She knew, and I locked it all away. I locked her away. You were grieving, Melinda said softly, her own cheeks wet. You did what you could to survive. He shook his head, but the old, corrosive guilt didn't take hold. Instead, a new resolve, hard and clear, formed in its place. He looked at the box of drives, then at Melinda, her face etched with compassion in the twilight. She left a road map, he said, his voice gaining strength. And God, or fate, or whatever you want to call it, sent you to help me follow it. He picked up the final drive. Will you help me? Help me use these? Let them hear their mother again. Let them learn from her, through you. Melinda nodded, her eyes shining. Every day, but as Ernest clutched the plastic drive, neither of them could know that resurrecting Catherine's voice would not just heal, it would reveal. It would unlock a depth of understanding in the girls that would prove Catherine had been more right than she could have imagined, and would force Ernest to defend the fragile new world they were building from those who viewed it as a threat. 2 weeks later, the miracle deepened. Catherine's voice had become part of the daily fabric of the music room. Her lullabies, her instructions, her playful narration filled the space. Ernest feared it would trigger regression, a painful confusion. Instead, Ella and Lily responded like plants to the sun. Their movements became more fluid, their engagement more sustained. It was as if a part of their brains, dormant since the trauma, recognized this frequency and woke up. That afternoon, they were all in the room. Ernest, Melinda, and the girls. Catherine's favorite Brahms lullaby played. Melinda was guiding them through a simple sequence: reach, turn, fold. The girls followed, their faces serene with concentration. Midway through a turn, Lily stopped dead. The room froze. Ernest's heart plummeted. Was it too much? Had they pushed too far? Lily stood perfectly still, staring not at the mirror, not at the window, but directly at Melinda. Her brow was furrowed in deep thought. Then, clear as a bell in the quiet room, she spoke, again. The word hung in the air, perfectly enunciated, full of intent. The music played on, but to Ernest, the world had gone utterly silent save for that one precious word. He slapped a hand over his mouth to stifle a cry. Melinda's eyes flooded, but her therapist's training held. She kept her face calm, her voice even. Again, she echoed gently, You want to do it again, sweetheart? Lily nodded, a firm, deliberate dip of her chin. Then she said it again, clearer. Again, Ernest couldn't draw a breath. His daughter, his nonverbal daughter, She had not just parroted a sound. She had assessed an activity, formed a desire, and communicated it. Intentionally, Melinda, smiling through her tears, raised her arms, beginning the sequence anew. This time, Lily mouthed the words silently as she moved, again. When they finished, Lily didn't retreat into herself. She turned her head and looked at her father. She truly saw him. And then she spoke two words that dismantled the last of Ernest's broken heart and began rebuilding it anew. Mama singing, full meaning, a statement, a connection. That sound is Mama. Mama is singing. Ernest fell to his knees. Lily walked over, not shuffled, not drifted, walked with purpose and placed her small, cool hand on his wet cheek. Mama singing, she repeated. We dance, he gathered her in, and for the first time since she was a toddler, Lily wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. Ella, drawn by the powerful emotion, pressed her whole body against his side, burying her face in his shirt. Melinda knelt with them, her hand on Ernest's shaking shoulder. Completing the circle, she spoke. Ernest choked out. She did, Melinda whispered, her voice thick with joy. That night, Ernest sat in his dark office, the digital recording of Lily's again, playing on a loop. He should have been ecstatic, calling family, alerting the world. Instead, a cold, pragmatic fear settled in his gut. This breakthrough was unorthodox. It existed outside the sanctioned charts of behavioral milestones. It was born of unregulated methods by an unlicensed former therapist. He thought of Dr. Althea Morrison, her sharp, disapproving face. He had, foolishly, emailed her the video this morning with the subject line, breakthrough. He'd been bursting with pride, desperate for validation from the authority he'd once revered. Her reply had been a terse, I need to observe. Tomorrow, 3 p.m., the battle lines, he realized with a sinking heart, were about to be drawn, and he was utterly unprepared.